just limited ourselves to reaction to double standards with regard to Russia. These times have passed. Now we cannot afford ourselves to wait from the organizations that impose double standards, some independent reaction, some adequate estimation of the events, because many times they are not impartial, and they are talking about that now for these crimes being investigated, and for the reaction to these crimes the joint work of the authorities is required. And the post of ambassador at large on the crimes of the Kiev regime has been introduced, and this post has been given to a participant of the contact group to settle the situation in Donbass, Rodion Miroshnik. His responsibility is to conduct, on behalf of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, to collect the information, to prepare reports based on investigations on the most notorious crimes against medical staff, journalists, priests, and other people. This work will be systematic. I think as soon as possible, Mr. Miroshnik will speak to the media himself and inform the global community on the Kiev regime crimes regularly. I would also like to say a few words on the 16th of August, a new book by Maxim Grigoriev and Dmitry Sablin, Ukrainian Crimes Against Humanity, was published. We will post a link to this book in the text of today's briefing. In this book, the crimes from 2022 to 2023 are mentioned. As you know, the crimes of the Kiev regime are not limited to these dates. It's not the first book from on this topic. Previously, ordinary fascism, war crimes of Ukrainian militants, and ordinary fascism, Ukrainian war crimes and human rights violations were published. We have talked about the constant torture, shelling, attacks on hospitals, and disappearance of civilians. All those data on truly heinous events have been collected by the International Public Tribunal and recorded in a new book by Mr. Grigoriev and Mr. Sablin. The author cites more than 600 witnesses, victims, and prisoners of war. They tell about constant attempts, shelling, loss of family members, attempts to escape under fire from the territory controlled by the Ukrainian armed forces. The book describes some heinous violation of human rights that allows to kill women and children, to beat priests and clergymen. And these crimes of the Kiev regime will have no statute of limitations, and will continue to report on them, to provide information on them, and legal estimations. We have drawn attention to the materials published in the Swedish media on the use of broadband internet materials by Kiev. These technologies can become alternative Starlink devices. The materials are claimed to be used only for civilian purposes. So the Kiev regime is the so-called peaceful organization. It's a club of neo-Nazis. So peaceful Swedish businessmen will just supply some civilian materials, I think for some games, not more. So let us be serious. What is that and what is the purpose? The company does not deny. I would remind you that a Swedish company that these are dual-use items, and these products can be used for military purposes to ensure, among other things, communication in the field. So those advertised peaceful, so-called peaceful technologies will be used at Vancouver for coordination of hostilities. And we perceive this as another Russophobic action to please the United States and controlled under the patronship of the United States. So it's a threat for all the states, and that's just direct access to satellites bypassing national operators and widely used to interfere in the internal affairs of independent states. So that's to coordinate the illegal protest activities. I can cite an example. It was Starlink terminals in Iran in autumn 2022. The Swedes buy their supplies. They just intended to illustrate the effectiveness of their materials, but it's just illegal dual-use items. They're used for dual purpose, and there will be actions taken by the Russian Federation. And what I have spoken about at the beginning of the today briefing, I would like to speak in detail on two items. The media controlled by Washington, London, and Brussels, the narratives of those media, politological estimates, this imposed concept. First of all, I would like to speak about the situation in the global grain market. And we have all been said that we should save the poorest countries from famine, to fight for people, for the starvation to stop. And for that, the grain deals were required, that it acquired some civilized form of the Black Sea Initiative, the package agreement, and so on and so forth. When all that mystification was unveiled and the efforts of Russia were not fruitful because they were blocked by the West, and it became clear who becomes rich due to that. And when Russia left all that, there was a monstrous media campaign that allegedly food prices grew because of Russia's actions. And here, in all that, Moscow is to blame. That's the first topic I would like to highlight today. After the end of the Black Sea Initiative, we can state the lack of changes for the grain products in the world. And the market prices for grain, they demonstrated a slight increase, and in further days, not weeks, not months, but days, the price of future contracts for grain, it just returned to its former level. It just decreased. And at the end of August this year, the tendency has been confirmed by other trading platforms, where the price is fixed at the same level, and according to the trade, the price for these products, it decreased, and its current price is $188 for a ton. And in general, the aggregate indicators for the agricultural products are comparable to the ones of the previous year. And the grain shipped on free on board conditions, and with all the risks in the port being passed to the buyer, it was $249 US for a ton. That's less than the price of the same period 2 years ago. I would highlight it was 2 years ago. The purchases from the French yuan in 2021 year, it can be compared. So only we see these figures, are they concealed from the global community? And now I have another question. Where are those Western media, internet media, television broadcasts? Where are all of them? Why do they not deal with the facts available to anyone who has any desire to study the situation? The quotes of the grains in middle term can be due to many factors. Among them are just natural factors due to climate change, drought, hurricanes, floods, speculative actions in markets. And the third factor is emergencies. For example, fires in France and Turkey in August this year. So unfortunately, it's an example of what I'm talking about. They were presented during the 58th session on the 14th of June in London. This is not the data of intelligence. I present you open data now, and according to the estimations of the Global Grain Council, there are currently no crisis manifestations in the production of grain and their trade. So I seeing and reading this. Moreover, the seeing and reading this. Moreover, the seeing and reading this. Moreover, the in 26% for wheat and the stop of the Black Sea Initiative, it allegedly led to a change of food prices. And Russia is the reason for the turbulence in world markets. So Russia has become a very inconvenient factor in this product case. And not now, but around 20 years ago, when it restored its agriculture. Back then, the problems began with Russia because we became not only competitive, but also leaders in that sphere. Because for decades, for many years, we have been told that we cannot produce food, that soon we will be introduced into the club of the civilized countries and be fed during their schedules and not when we want to eat ourselves. We just realized that on time and entered the club of the true leaders of the production of agricultural products. And then the real problems began for the West. Not only it was something wrong done by us, but them having problems with ideology, them not allowing that even in their nightmares, because of them being so-called exclusive. So we observe attempts to force Russia out of the global food market and to support their own corporations, and all this hysteria around the grain deals, allegedly for aid to the poorest countries. It was for only one aim: to decrease our attractiveness in the eyes of global community as a producer, stable producer and supplier of food products.
In order to continue to control or to seek to control this area, in order to once again to reassert its dominance, it's very simple. I would like to say that we should have said for a long time ago that today it's impossible to feed the planet without our country. And we, compared to other countries, Western countries, has never politicized this factor. We have always been a reliable supplier of agricultural products. According to forecasts, the main suppliers of wheat for 2022 and 2023, I mean the agricultural year, will be Russia, the EU countries, Australia, Canada, the United States, and Ukraine. And that's the sequence. According to the Department of Agriculture of the United States, the period for 23-24 will harvest about 800 million tons of wheat. It's slightly more compared to 2022 and 23. That's about forecasts. At the same time, while the stocks of this wheat in 2023 and 24 will increase by 1.5% due to increased production of global trade in wheat by 0.8%. We expect that Russia will increase its supplies to foreign markets by 4.5%. And now I would like to cite some Western sources. The The Economist Intelligence Unit mentions that the wheat harvest in Ukraine in this agricultural year will reduce by 32% compared to 2021-22, up to 22.5 million tons. In 2023-24, this indicator will amount to 19 million tons, and the export will drop by 10 million tons. It's said that the British Economist Intelligence Unit did not write that the soil in Ukraine is now contaminated with radioactive wastes due to supplies by the United Kingdom with the projectiles with depleted uranium. These supplies are being continued for several months already and are used by the Kiev regime in the relevant territories to which we pointed out on many occasions. And the radioactive index also proves that point. And this impacts the quality of agricultural products from Ukraine. It's very sad that the UK, Canadian, EU newspapers do not say a word about this. At the same time, Russia continues to faithfully implement its international contract agreements in exporting agricultural products. We understand the role of socially important goods for the social and economic development of Asia, Africa, Latin America, and Middle East in the achievement of sustainable development goals. We this can be reaffirmed initiatives by Vladimir Putin on supply free of charge to those in need of the tens and dozens of tons of Russian fertilizers which were arrested in European ports, as well as wheat, to Burkina Faso, Zimbabwe, Mali, Somalia, Central African Republic, Eritrea. While with the Russia's initiative, we're working out alternative supplies to the poorest states of the national foods in order to compensate the damage from forced termination of this Black Sea initiative. Let me remind you that all the problems associated with the Black Sea initiative are because of illegitimate and immoral sanctions of the United States of America, the European Union, as well as all those countries who joined these sanctions or adopted them unilaterally against our country under US pressure. And the second topic, the same old story, which has been developed and actively planted in the information space on anti-Russia sanctions, that they damage only Russia. That's what we've been told in Brussels, London, Paris, Berlin. And no European Union do not suffer from these sanctions. So they say that they attack exactly the state, I mean Russia. And they did not say a word about any collateral damage from anti-Russia legitimate sanctions. That's what I've heard from Mr. Borrell, Biden, Blinken, Mr. Stoltenberg, everyone. Now, let's move on to the facts. The global economy continues to suffer losses due to total ending up of the United States and satellites of trade and economic ties with Russia and coerce other states to this. The key international high think tanks and we will cite to the resources which are verified by the West. For the Western mass media to trust, because they trust the WMF, the World Bank, they trust it. So, please. As for the key think tanks are trying not to focus on this. They are focusing on the restraining factors such as high level of consumer prices, tightening of monetary policy, overall debt, war in Ukraine, climate change. But nevertheless, this negative impact of anti-Russia restrictions for the development of global economic system in their reports is being taken into account. They do not want it, despite any bans or huge efforts of the United States to minimize such statistics. In fact, the World Bank shows it. So now let's start. The Monetary Fund believes that the current geopolitical tensions heated by sanctions increases risks of separation of the global economy into quasi-autonomous blocks. This fragmentation leads to a growth of restrictions in trade, in particular with strategic goods, including fossil fuels. This hinders cross-border movement of working capitals, technologies, and working force. Well, that's the key indicators of the global economy. As a result, this leads to commodity volatility, increased inflation, lower incomes of citizens, undermining collective efforts to implement the Sustainable Development Goals up to 2030. International experts are compelled to admit that unilateral sanctions of the United States, the EU, and their satellites damage also their initiators. The Monetary Fund and the World Bank states the stagnating economy of the majority of G7 countries. The Financial Times estimated, and we can trust them even in the West, the huge European companies since the beginning of the special military operation, and this coincided with those, according to Biden, health sanctions lost at least 100 billion euro. More losses were among oil and gas companies, financial structures and banks, as well as industrial enterprises. I'm talking firstly about economic operators from the UK, Germany, and France. I believe that's the time and the moment to name them. Most losses were fixed among the following companies: British Petroleum, 23.3 billion euro loss; Total Energies, 13.5 billion euros; Uniper, 5.7 billion euros losses. I'm telling you losses. Fortum, 5.3 billion euros; Shell, 3.7 billion euro; OMV, 2.5 billion euro; Wagner, 1 billion euro of losses; Renault, 2.5 billion euros; Volkswagen, 2 billion euros; Société Générale, 3.1 billion euro. Denial of the Russian fuel costs, for example, to the Polish state oil company Orlen, to $27 million per day. That's a very important addition. Due to the closure of airspace of Russia for the transit flights of the US companies, the number of flights between the United States and China, for example, decreased up to 24 flights per week compared to 340 flights per week before the pandemic. And that leads to huge losses among the air companies. And the flights to Asia and huge spendings are being fixed by the Asian operators. For example, the flight from Paris to Tokyo now lasts 14 hours instead of 9. That's very unprofitable. The Minister of Trans of Russia says that the losses of air companies in the United States and Europe amount to $37.5 billion per week, and that's a very important amendment. In international payments, the share of alternative currencies grows. The share of the US dollar dropped by 60%. Let me remind, in 2002, this was 72%. Euro dropped to 19%. In 2008, it was 28%. And yuan, by the way, increased by 3% and increased 3 times since 2016. A number of states intensified the searches of the ways to use their national currencies in international payments. And of course, I'm talking about yuan. The blocking of Russian banks in terms of SWIFT stimulated the development of national instruments with the same potential, for example, in India, Iran, and so on. Trade in national currencies is being actively shifted in Turkey, Arab Emirates, Brazil, Argentina, and many other countries. The president of Argentina and Brazil started to develop the monetary alignment of the two states. And unwillingness of the West to deny the monopoly in the system of global financial management leads to the creation of alternative financial platforms, for example, the Asian Monetary Fund. The collective West continues this disinformation campaign to accuse Russia of the crisis situation in the world food market. But all the things are interconnected. Our country is charged with the looming global famine because of spark in global prices, food prices, and fertilizers due to the special military operation to defend the population of Donbass. And I cited just the figures provided by the international organizations where the collective West is a party to. They continue to discredit Russia as a reliable and responsible actor of global food market, one of the key suppliers of foods to the countries in need. In fact, everything is blocked by the Western countries. I'm talking about the payments, transport, And the cargoes, which Russia had not even transshipped as a humanitarian aid, but paid their delivery to the destination points, to the most poorest states. Even the cargoes were blocked. At the same time, the international experts name the root causes of this food inflation as shifts in the global economy, systematic mistakes and miscalculations in the macroeconomic, energy and food policy of the large Western states. And of course, these are climate crisis, pandemic, its consequences, massive anti-Russia unilateral sanctions. All these aggravated these negative trends and triggered disbalance in global markets, mainly in the agricultural products. High energy prices for which because of the Western desire to shift to energy, to green energy, sparked tariffs for transport shipments. For example, natural gas grew. For example, up to 80% of all these waste goes for because of fertilizers. And that's the objective argument of the growth of prices. For example, the potash fertilizers amounted to $562 per ton. This is 2.5 more than compared to January 1st, 2022. And this is compared to the crisis in 2008. This situation can trigger to famine in the poorest countries of the world. But why all this? Russia has always remained a responsible supplier. But on the other hand, we cannot supply because we are banned of logistical infrastructure. Our cargoes are banned. Moreover, they are whipping up a hysterical campaign against Russia. All these trends have an unbiased factor in which the West hushes up. For example, FAO underscores that the food prices sparked before the beginning of the special military operations. The group of researchers from the Swedish Agricultural University said that there was no connection between the situation in Ukraine and the price volatility on wheat. No one can say a word about this. Unilateral measures of economic pressure of the collective West against our country aggravated negative trends in terms of transport and logistics. They blocked port terminals abroad, which carried out transshipment of our food and industrial items. International monetary logistical campaigns and banks stopped the credit to ensure the sales contracts of fertilizers from Russia. That's the point. The West, indiscriminately blaming Russia in food crisis, hushes up the fact that the main beneficiaries of these food prices are huge corporations who produce and trade in agricultural products. Exactly of the West, I'm talking about the four great countries. This is Archie Daniels, American, Bunge and Cargill, as well as the Netherlands, Louis Dreyfus, whose share amounts to 75.90 global trade in agricultural products. In 2022, Cargill increased its sales up to 23%, amounting to $165 million. There was a record profit, 5 times increase in profit. And they spare a lot of money on the PR campaigns, on this information propaganda, of all these stories about these grain deals. We can analyze the dynamics of the prices of the spendings on PR campaigns, and that will make clear everything. A significant contribution to improve its indexes and profits of the subsidiaries in Ukraine. These four companies, and as for the chemical corporation Monsanto, El DuPont, the numerous, possess more than 17 billion hectares out of 32 million hectares of the fertile lands. As a result, the Ukrainian wheats It's just over-flooded the markets of the Eastern Europe and just put on the brink of survival the local farmers. But that's just a story for children, how they ate the sweet and then they just died because they eat a lot. Let me repeat, in July 2023, FAO recorded a slight increase of food prices, which amounted to 1.3 increase in June and 11.8 lower compared to July 2022. The dynamics of currency indexes of the first month proves that there are no harsh fluctuations for the prices of wheat. Immediately after the termination of the grain deal, there was a slight increase in prices, but the next day the price for wheat decreased. As for August 11th, the indexes continued downward. We've already voiced these figures, and we can repeat them in the text of the briefing. But all these trends, they continue, and that's the case.
The aggregated figures of the prices for food products, they're comparable to the level of 2021. And it's just not claims that the Russia or special military operation and withdrawal from the Black Sea Initiative allegedly led to increase in food prices, and allegedly our country is the main cause of turbulence in food markets. Please base your statements on the facts and make some logical conclusions on the basis of facts. So FAO is far from a normal solution, and an obstacle are increased tariffs to process food raw materials and high inflation. Russia continues to fulfill its obligations under international contracts for export products and the continued supplies of our food products despite the discriminatory restrictive measures by the US, some media campaigns and other obstacles have a stabilizing effect on the global supply and demand balance. In general, the Western sanctions policy and Russia's measures to counteract the restrictions and adapt to new challenges have become a powerful trigger for the reformatting of the entire system of global economic relations. This process has only just begun and is gaining momentum. And the rebuilding of global realities in trade, in transport, in logistics, agricultural industry, it is becoming inevitable despite the remaining difficulties and artificial obstacles. I would like to pass to the next topic. It has just been mentioned in the latest hours. It's regarding the situation in the Gabonese Republic. The National Assembly declaring the dissolving of the government and the transition of the state power. It was after the Gabonese Electoral Commission announced results of the presidential elections, where leader Odimwan were concerned about the deterioration of the domestic situation in this friendly African country. We continue to closely follow the development of the situation and to hope for its early stabilization. According to the Russian embassy in Libreville, there have been no reports of casualties among Russian citizens in Gabon. We recommended our contemporary compatriots refrain from traveling to that country unless absolutely necessary. Now, Afghanistan, a meeting in the State Duma of Mr. Mironov with the Taliban National Front of Afghanistan. We would like to comment on this situation. Moscow continues to build the interaction with the current government of Afghanistan that in recent years in general has demonstrated its ability to control the situation in the country. Nevertheless, the processes in the country have not yet become irreversible. There are serious risks associated with socio-economic problems, the provision of basic rights and freedoms, and that will be used by international terrorist organizations, first and foremost ISIS, which is planning further expansion outside Afghanistan, in particular in Central Asia. And we call on Kabul and representatives of Afghan national minorities to engage in dialogue with a view to forming a truly inclusive government and fight against terrorism and drug-related crimes with respect to basic human rights and freedoms. I would like to draw your attention on another annual issue of the Foreign Ministry of the Russian Federation that includes speeches by Minister Sergei Lavrov on the issues of foreign policy for the past year. There is the collection in Russian and English. The yearbook and photo materials are published on the website. There is also an electronic version on a compact disc and additionally published on the internet portal. And it will be sent to universities, to libraries, and so on. And it is prepared by the Department of Information and Press and intended for diplomats, international specialists, and those interested in contemporary Russian foreign policy. Another topic in Nat in Hungary, after increased restoration works, the inauguration of the military monument took place. It was done financed by Russian companies, namely Gazprom, and the monument was restored and its territory as well. And on marble, there have been posted names of those who perished during the liberation of Hungary from the German Nazis. And for the 24th time, as you know, Glava PDK held its summer games in the Zavidovo complex in the village of Shusha, and representatives from more than 20 teams of diplomatic missions took part. Also representatives of Russian mass media, the TASS news agency, the Mir TV channel. As you know, the participants were greeted by Sergei Lavrov, the Minister of Foreign Affairs. This holiday, for its 25-year history, has become a symbol of professional solidarity of diplomats from different parts of the world. Glava PDK took part in this event, as well as Vyacheslav Fatin, Svetlana Zhurova, and fencing champion Galina Gorokhova. They became the chief arbiters of the competition. A detailed material will be today published in the text of the briefing, and you will learn many interesting things there. And in Orenburg, another International Eurasia Global Forum ended in Yekaterinburg on the 27th of August. It became the countdown was launched to the World Youth Festival, planned to be held in 2024 on the territory of Syria, and that will host 20,000 Russian and foreign guests. It was about a discussion of the current geopolitical environment, and the declaration of a multipolar world was developed, whose aim is to change the perception of the omnipotence, the so-called omnipotence of the Western Bloc. The main pillars became the respect of the sovereignty of states, international cooperation, and joint solutions to global problems. Traditionally, on the last day of Eurasia Global, participants were awarded grants to develop their own projects. On the 29th of August, within the framework of the UN General Assembly, the International Day Against Nuclear Tests is marked. As you know, this event is held annually. It's an opportunity to remind who bears responsibility for that. And I think we should mark this occasion, this date, on the 6th or 9th of August. It was on those days, 78 years ago, that the United States leadership implemented its decision to use nuclear weapons against the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Those weapons were used against civilian objects in Japan in order to prove to the entire world the force of those weapons of mass destruction. As it has become known, those strikes were absolutely pointless, as the fate of militaristic Japan was sealed by August 1945. At present, there is a tendency to ignore the fact that the US was the only state to have used nuclear weapons. The distortion of historical memory can have serious consequences. There is a necessity to introduce a comprehensive ban on nuclear tests, the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, but who creates main obstacles here? Just guess. That's the United States of America, who denied to ratify this treaty. And an announcement, a date marked the Day of Solidarity in the fight against terrorism, introduced into the legislation after an heinous terror attack in Beslan that led to the deaths, among other things, of minors. It's just an heinous crime that illustrated the unification of all the global community against terrorism. But in the current international situation, the countering terrorism has lost its unifying basis. Now the hybrid war is openly conducted against Russia. And the terror essence of the Kiev regime is being ignored, and just the terror Kiev regime is being sponsored. And the isolation of our country by the Western states has not been successful, as Russia is conducting dialogue with friendly states, and they are of priority to us, and the fruitful cooperation is within the CIS, CSTO, SCO, and member states in this associations. It just led under the regional and anti-terror SCO structure. And the CSTO, it can deploy its collective peacekeeping forces. It's an important factor in the sphere of its responsibility. And one of the most advanced cross-regional formats of anti-terrorist cooperation is the BRICS Working Group on Anti-Terrorism, elaborated in 2020 and 2021 under the Russian and Indian chairmanships. The anti-terror BRICS strategy and the implementation plan are the gold standard, reflecting a sober and sensible vision of real, rather than imaginary, global terrorist threats. The Russian Federation also maintains constructive dialogue on counter-terrorism issues with the state of the African continent, and the commonality of our countries' approaches was reflected in the Declaration on Strengthening Cooperation on Combating Terrorism, adopted at the end of the second summit held in St. Petersburg in June this year. We continue to coordinate our joint efforts in the multilateral formats, including those aimed at improving the existing mechanism with the participation of all the states. And regarding the day of victory over militaries Japan and the end of the Second World War, it's just restoring the historical truth and reflecting the heroic deeds of the Soviet people. The defeat of the enemy in Manchuria, Sakhalin and the Kurils were a decisive contribution to the defeat and surrender of Japan, thus putting an end to the bloodshed started by Hitler's Germany and opening the way to the restoration of long-awaited peace. After the surrender of Nazi Germany, Japan remained the only Axis member fighting with the anti-Hitler coalition. During the Potsdam Conference of the 26th of July 1945, there was unconditional surrender and the basic principles for peaceful settlements in Japan, eradication of militarism, removal of military expansion, severe punishment for war criminals, reshaping of the areas of economy, the sovereignty of Japan, and as well as the islands of Honshu, Shikoku, and some other that are smaller. As Japan denied those requests, the USSR declared war on Japan on the 8th of August. Led by Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky, our troops entered the Manchurian plain, disfigured the Japanese forces into isolated groups. The enemy almost began to surrender, and the enemy troops were destroyed in Manchuria. Our troops captured Harbin, Mukden, Changchun, Girin, and liberated Northeast China and North Korea, landed on South Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands, and Japan was deprived of real forces and opportunities to continue the war. Only as prisoners, 640,000 Japanese servicemen were taken as prisoners. On board of the American battleship Missouri on the 2nd of September 1945, Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu and Japanese Chief of Staff Yoshihiro Umezu signed an unconditional surrender act. And the end of the war with Japan marked the end of the Second World War. On the 3rd of September 1945, Soviet newspapers published Joseph Stalin's address to the nation, marking the victory over Japan. And there was the medal for the victory over Japan, and it had the date on its reverse side, the 3rd of September 1945. So that's just the historical data for the name of this day. And what is now happening in the international affairs is just how the historical events are forgotten, how quickly. And those events, the reckless events implemented in the present. Now, the present Japan, with the Fumio Kishida administration, is embarking on the path of revanchism and Russophobia. It has been warned of the danger of the militaristic frenzy that engulfs Tokyo, and the war ended as a national catastrophe for Japan. We hope that the Japanese people will have enough wisdom not to allow the politicians to repeat the fatal mistakes of their predecessors and to abandon their dangerous plans that threaten to destabilize the geopolitical situation in the world as a whole. And I am ready to answer your question.
Whether international life is with us. Good afternoon, Madam Zakharova. A couple of days before, Emmanuel Macron declared that the policy of the country excludes the participation of the direct participation of the country in the Ukrainian conflict. He said that we are seeking to avoid any confrontation. Let me interpret from French to Russian. He said that the direct engagement in the conflict with Russia, they are trying to exclude this possibility. That means that they provide for some indirect participation. But the nature does not change. Such statements of the French officials are not fresh. We are hearing time and again that France does not consider itself a party to a conflict, and another quotation, avoids its escalation, seeks to avoid its escalation. So where are they located? And maybe they believe that someone will believe it. It seems that France is trying to justify itself because there are facts. Let us recall the large-scale and unimpeded military and technical aid. Not the French people, but the politicians help. France was one of the first countries which started supplying the Kiev with munitions, launched the tank coalition, initiated the supply of military aviation, actively trains the Ukrainian armed forces. Some recent admissions of Ambassador of Ukraine in France, Mr. Omельченко, in an interview to Ukrainian newspaper Levy Berig, on the regular meetings with the representatives of the General Staff of France, when he, according to his words, feels himself like being in the General Staff of Ukraine. He was talking about the exchange of intelligence information. They agreed on the terms of long-range missiles and air defense equipment, and that proves indirect engagement of Paris in this conflict. Is that a direct way to escalate the crisis? If it's not a direct path, then it means something else. It is obvious that the Caesar artillery systems, the tanks IMX-10RC and cruise missiles go to Ukraine not to be demonstrated and exhibited. Because of them, people are dying. The French arms are for many years are sowing death among civilians, destroy residential areas and civilian infrastructure. Everyone knows it. Maybe some people do not know because they are not told about this. And it seems that France has its share of responsibility. It is obvious for us that along with other Western countries, France continues to cynically use the Kiev regime as a tool to fight Russia. And this fight, Paris is ready to continue until the last Ukrainian, I believe. And let me remind you some more aspects. Responsibility of France is not because they supply weapons, and when they say that they are not in direct engagement. So let us remember not the year 2022, because it was exactly France who was among other Western countries, but I'm talking about official representatives of France who stand at the very roots of the Ukrainian crisis. They participated directly in coup d'etat in Ukraine, not for once. They intruded in domestic affairs of Ukraine as a sovereign state. This was made by officials of France. Of course, now they would say that these were not these very political figures, but some other, their predecessors, and that's they who are responsible. Maybe that's not they who are responsible, but France, being a country, is responsible for such actions. And another point, as you know, all these considerations about direct or indirect participation in a conflict, this is just all not moral. This is not just fakes. This is beyond any moral values, against the backdrop of colossal losses of lives, of civilian lives. This is beyond any moral limits. And yet another point. Thus, the LSA palace cannot say what they are doing aloud. Let them say loud. Why do we do they for them? Do the citizens of France believe that this is not indirect participation? And
maybe it will be useful for Mr. Macron. I will share this information with him for the future, because you cannot be a little bit pregnant. And one more question. How would you comment on a statement by Josep Borrell, the head of the European diplomacy, who in his blog estimated the efficiency of sanctions against Russia, saying that they work, that they are effective? I absolutely agree. That's the case when I absolutely agree with Mr. Borrell. Yes, they are effective with their work, but primarily against the European Union. So I would like to ask him a question. Was it the initial aim of Brussels, or it's just the situation? We have returned to this topic many times today, but I have just cited examples of the EU companies who bore colossal losses due to these anti-Russia sanctions. But we all see these pseudo-analytical publications by Mr. Borrell. I am sure that it's not him who is writing. I am sure that someone writes for him. I do not know whether he reads that before the publication, just clear him of responsibility, but I'm sure that is not him who is writing that. Just wanting to convince someone that the sanctions against our country are working just against us and only against us. This is just useless. The
economic considerations is just another attempt of the Western disinformators to make unsophisticated readers the illusion that Russia is weak. There is no withstand any criticism. The thesis at the end of this article that the economic isolation of our country is final, especially against the backdrop of this landmark event in South Africa, which symbolizes the new world order. If they want to talk about isolation, so we can support this idea. Was this self-isolation of the European Union? This was a self-isolation of the West, like the global minority. They encircled themselves in red colors. They call themselves a blooming garden. All the rest they call the jungles, and that's the way they live. So there's no voluntary self-isolation of the EU. It was a step-by-step self-isolation under US pressure. So let us recall Mr. Biden when he was Vice President of the United States, when he told about his pressures on the EU to adopt anti-Russia sanctions. And the EU adopted such sanctions. And all this continued at the new level and led to the flee of the EU companies from the territories from EU to the United States, re-registration there. This led to huge losses of profits. That's what we referred to in many mass media articles. By isolating itself from Russia and from Russia's energy resources, from Russia's economy, they undermined their competitiveness on the global markets. And we scale up cooperation with reliable partners, with the developing centers of the global development, which are developing much more in an intensive way. Russia made a clear example that any stifling unilateral illegitimate sanctions adopted by the Western minority bypassing the UN Security Council are ineffective. They are working against them. They are working indirectly, undermine the global processes, but they do not work the way they were designed to act. The international community and majority do not support these sanctions. Moreover, in the Johannesburg Declaration, the BRIC states recorded the general position, and I quote, "Unilateral coercive measures are incompatible with the UN Charter and detail negative consequences, especially for the developing world." It also expressed a concern because of the sanctions touching upon the trade in agricultural items. So, to whom this message was addressed, and that's the result of this sanction war unleashed by the EU and the United States. The EU restrictions, this is just an instrument for intimidating and blackmailing. We consider it inadmissible direct threats to Russia's on behalf of Joseph Borrell, who said that the EU has not yet enlarged restrictions against supplies to Russia of medical items, food and medical equipment. And this is yet to be planned. Does he has any clear understanding what he's talking about? Is he sensible in this? Is he aware that that was the logic of terrorists who captured hospitals, who captured patients and deprived them of the medical aid, and so urgent medical aid? Is he sensible enough? Is he sensible enough in the words he is voicing? Maybe we can recall him of the blocked Leningrad to deprive the people of the food and to see how they are dying in the city. That was the Nazis' logic. We can ask a question to Borrell. Did he hear anything about the Leningrad blockade and those who suffered this period? So let his advisors remind him of this event in the history. That's the repetition of the Nazi logic at the level of the leaders of the European Union. That's the statement is in line with other Borrell's statements that EU is like a blooming garden and all the rest is jungles. But it's much more worse because it reveals the nature of this structure and the nature of the people who lead it, and which is based, the logic of whom is based on segregation of people. I'm not talking about political freedoms. So all this is forgotten there, and that is just a manifestation of neo-Nazism. And I've cited such examples. That's the logic of modern terrorists who capture hospitals and hold people who need medical aid. And that was the logic of the Nazis during the Third Reich, when they detained the whole cities in blockade and seeing how people were dying. And recently, the EU has warned sanctions not only to Russia, and even to third countries who refuse to accede to the anti-Russia sanction regime. It was exactly against them, the 11th package of anti-Russia restrictive measures, who provide embargo for the supplies of the EU production to third countries. It is obvious that this, which seemed recently huge economy of the European Union, built on exploitation of resources of the developing countries, does not cope with the consequences of the disruption of economic ties with Russia. We see deindustrialization, shift of technological production in the United States, high inflation, huge state debt, and chronic budget deficit in the member states. You can analyze the statistical service of the EU to see that economic growth of the EU is at zero level and inflation exceeds the targets, especially its food component. It's 12.4%, and this is July of this year. And this decreases the welfare of a considerable number of citizens in the EU. Did Joseph Borrell make any comment on that? He is very happy about the reduction of trade with Russia. He made a report. I'm sorry. So what are the consequences of this block for trade? The EU indexes fell as well. Maybe he is pleased that due to his policy, the European Union pays 3 times for the gas, and the EU producers were deprived of the markets to sell their products. I can agree with Joseph Borrell in one point. Anti-Russia sanctions, they are indeed effective, but effective against the European Union, with the hands of the leaders who stop to understand and to distinguish the interests of its own and the interests of Washington. And despite all hopes of Western analysts, we expect the GDP growth by the year 2024. So we'll see what will come next. Thank you. Let me ask you yet another question. How can you comment the response of the Greek Cypriot authorities on the launch of the Russian consular services in the Turkish Republic of the North Cyprus? As you know, the consular services to those citizens who live in the north has been carried out for many time. We believe that the Russian citizens should have adequate access to effective consular services and consular aid. And this work shall continue the way which is in line with our national interests. Thank you very much. Is Rush today with us? Madame Zakharova, good afternoon. Don Kotigert, Russia Today. The Republican candidate, Haley, during his debates, insulted the memory of the Russian permanent representative Vitaly Churkin, draw comparisons between the aircraft crash and the loss of life of Mr. Churkin. And she said that Mr. Putin was responsible. She's a liar. She lies. And let me suggest an experiment. If she does not provide any evidence of her words, and I can say that she won't do so, so you will see it yourself once again. So there are no comments. This is in line with the US politicians. They lie to everyone. And all those who are trying to tell the truth are becoming victims of those who lie. And that is very obvious. And second moment, when Haley will tell the international community who killed Kennedy, it's been 50 years when the world is waiting for an answer. This is the citizen of the United States, like herself. That was the president of the United States. That was a distinguished political figure. If some Haley is talking about this, maybe she knows who killed Kennedy and cleansed the whole clan of Kennedy. And that's the second question. The first one, I asked her to provide evidence to your lie, maybe the basis. And the second point, can you tell us about the destiny of the presidents and public figures who were killed back then, and the whole world does not yet know who killed President Kennedy. And everyone guesses. But officially, the United States of America has not answered to this question yet. If you do not have any questions, is Komsomolskaya Pravda with us? Good afternoon, Madame Zakharova. Good afternoon. In September, Sergei Lavrov is expected to head the New York delegation to participate in the 78th session of the UN General Assembly. What is done in order to avoid repetition of the history of the story when the United States not issue visas to journalists who wanted to accompany the head of the foreign ministry? I would like. So I can say that the the Americans do not issue visas both for diplomats who went to the UN General Session, both for the political party, which is called as Political Week, and throughout the whole year of the UN General Assembly sessions. The United States did not issue visa to sports, to athletes, cultural figures, researchers, international participants of international contests, to parliamentarians, for those who went to the General Assembly or who went to in line with the interparliamentarian relations. So the United States of America denied visas to everyone, although they had to do so. And let me remind that in accordance with the agreement on the location of the headquarters of the United Nations, which is in force since 1947, the United States assumed responsibility to ensure unimpeded access for accredited foreign officials there. However, we confront such problems not only with, and that's not the case only with us, but with other UN member states. Our position is very clear to the United States, and we will compelled to remind that here we see the huge abuse of the privilege of the location of the headquarters. The administration has almost arbitrarily defines who can participate in the events and to whom access is denied. This is a flagrant violation of all norms of domestic and international law. This is unacceptable. And this is a flagrant violation of international law. And in case the situation repeats, of course, we will respond in a very serious way. And you know our reaction for non-issuance of visa for the last time. If you don't have any questions, is Media Corporation China with us today? Yes, good afternoon, Madame Zakharova. And they unilaterally activated the drop of radioactive water from Fukushima 1 to the sea, ignoring objections of the international community. So some experts believe the United States expressed support to Japan, and that question is very like an exchange of a play of courtesy between the two states. In accordance with the Agricultural Ministry of Japan, the United States is the country who reduced the import of agricultural products and fishing products in the first half of the year. So how can you comment this position of the United States? Thank you. As a politicized, so this question should be analyzed in terms of the existing laws, in terms of scientific figures. So that is why we call Tokyo to be very open on this sensitive issue. When we are talking about politicization, which the United States is engaged on a regular basis, then we see such stories. Representatives of Japan who defended that this water, radioactive water, is safe, and it's safe to the extent that they can drink it, but they refuse to drink it. All the American politicians who supported Japan in this issue can be express solidarity and drink this water, being confident in its safety.
Thank you. Is Reuters with us? Yes, hello. Hello, Madam Zakharova. We have two questions. The first one, I would like to know the reaction of the Foreign Ministry for accusations by the US, the State Department, who accused Russia of intimidation of American diplomatic staff with accusation of espionage. That declaration was made against the background of the case of Robert Shonov, accused of confidential cooperation with foreign intelligence service. How can you comment on that? So it's ridiculous. Is it correctly Russia intimidating the US diplomats? I thought it's vice versa. Do you want me to cite some proof? I will just cite some facts that certify of the opposite. Not only of Russia not intimidating someone, but the US intimidating Russian diplomats. We have repeatedly voiced the information, cited the facts of the increased pressure on Russian diplomats working in the United States of America and the countries that are US satellites. What does that include? That includes engaging in their work, the approaches to get some information, psychological pressure on diplomats, members of their families, children, and we have spoken about blocking the accounts of Russian diplomatic missions. It has different forms. Is it just not making the work more difficult and not intimidation, not allowing to operate and do not allow normal operating procedures to the staff? It just includes not only salary, but also medical services, security, and the settlement of many social issues. And other examples, just seizures of diplomatic property of the real estates where the working space, the office, the studies, the premises of Russian diplomats, or where they were present, they were residing, and so on, and the social infrastructure used by Russian diplomats on the territory of the United States. Is it not intimidation? When we had to free our diplomats, they had to free the sites of Russian real estates on the territory of the US within 24 hours. Is it not intimidation when a helicopter was flying over Asta Bay and our real estate site there with a projector, and the cameras were filming from everywhere how the Russian diplomats, they had less than 2 days, just 24 hours, to carry all their belongings from there and to place that same site on some conservation. That was just 24 hours. And that was with the noise of all those helicopters. And the projectors, they just brought light into the faces of Russian diplomats. And the Russian diplomats who were given several days maximum or only 24 hours, and doing that with the last day of their stay on the territory of the US being the day of flights not arriving into to that city, for the Russian diplomats to automatically violate the US legislation. And that was the day chosen by the American authorities when there were no flights to that city. No direct flights, the US to Russia. Is it not intimidation when people were given 2 days to pack with their children, to terminate their studies? And it was a distance of several hundred kilometers to find the flights, and special flights that just saved them. And that was just non-issuance of visas. It is constant, and no prolongation of visas on the sites, and the constant manipulation of visa issue. Is that not intimidation? And the posters being placed in front of our diplomatic and consular missions with some proposals to join the American Special Services, and the advertisement banners on the screen of the computers of Russian diplomats with the elements of psychological pressure. Is that not intimidation? And direct threats posed in front of our diplomatic missions, the performances that are staged, telephone threats to personal working numbers, email messages with threats to Russian diplomats and their family members. Is that not intimidation? Can some American colleagues cite something similar? Never. Just response to some offenses by the American side. Now, with regard to Shonov, the Russian investigative authority is conducting the necessary activities and need to identify those who participate in that case, and the media has provided legal justification of the actions by Russian authorities. Thank you. And the second question, the detention of Russian military officer and a right-wing activist, Jan Petrovsky, from the Rusage group participating in military hostilities in Ukraine. And in Telegram, Mr. Petrovsky was accused the Russian diplomatic staff was accused of unwillingness to provide assistance to Petrovsky. Do you have some response to these accusations? Are there any contacts with Petrovsky himself, with his family? What is the justification by the Russian Foreign Ministry? Because now he's threatened with extradition to Ukraine, where he is accused of war crimes. There's a criminal code. So where was Reuters when Maria Butina was in American prison in solitary confinement? Where were you? So you are worried by the fate of Russian citizens by this topic. And Victor Boot, do you remember him? Where were you? I do not remember any question. Dear Reuters, please remember today, the 30th of August 2023. So let it be written in golden letters for your agency. So you are concerned, actually concerned about the fate of Russian citizens who are arrested abroad, who find themselves in complex situations. Please do not forget about many other people who are now in American prisons, who have been previously convicted, who are prosecuted. It's just some fantasy. I will just call just now Konstantin Yaroshenko. He will not believe that Reuters as a whole is engaged in the fate of Russians arrested abroad. So many years, we have drawn attention to that. No question by Reuters. In no way, no in written or neither in written nor in verbal form. I remember very well when Konstantin Yaroshenko was asking for help. He needed medical surgery. And we thought what he will say will be supported by the Western media. But no, only Russian diplomats supported him. And it was just severe dental pain. There were no painkillers. He was not provided painkillers. Just talk to Victor Boot. And Maria Butina is open for interaction. So it's just 3 persons. And Maria Butina, for many months, she was the avatar of the foreign ministry in social media. And no Western media was interested in that, in their fate, and in the fate of your compatriots, because the country of origin of Reuters is Great Britain, and Julian Assange was somewhere in London, and we will now reply your question. It's a pity you have not seen that we have already responded, because the information has already been published on the website of the ministry, on the social media of the ministry. But I will repeat, the information from the 20th of July is very important. The date, Vojislav Torden was detained by the Finnish border guard service while attempting to fly to Nice from Helsinki-Vantaa airport. Then he was placed in a temporary accommodation center where inter alia asylum seekers are accommodated. He has a Finnish residence permit and is listed in sections lists as Jan Petrovsky and might be wanted by the Ukrainian authorities. That was not reported back then. According to the explanations received from the Finnish law enforcement authorities, the detainee was free to use the telephone and was informed of his right to contact the Russian embassy. So there were no personal requests to the embassy which would have enabled the necessary consular assistance. They were not provided, and Mr. Torden has been represented by a local lawyer since the end of July 2023. On the 23rd of August 2023, the police informed the embassy that Mr. Torden was transferred to Vantaa prison for further extradition in a criminal case. Only at that time it became known that Mr. Torden had previously had the surname of Petrovsky. And the Ministry of Justice of Finland received a request from the Prosecutor General Office of Ukraine for his participation, I cited, in a terrorist organization or facilitation of the activities of a terrorist organization, Article 258.3 of the Criminal Code of Ukraine. The case was initiated in 2017 After receiving Torden's personal appeal on the 23rd of August, the measures to assist were taken. He was visited by consular staff. On the 25th of August, a hearing of the Finnish court was held, which decided to extend the period of detention. On the 28th of August, a consular officer of the embassy, together with a lawyer, visited the detainee, and the request for visit was sent beforehand, several days before that. So it was at the local authorities several days before being agreed. During the meeting, the Russian citizen said that he had no complaints about the conditions of detentions and expressed his wish to return to Russia as soon as possible. The Russian embassy in Helsinki continues to keep the matter under its special control and is ready to provide appropriate support to Mr. Torden in order to ensure the detainees' legal rights and interests. The efforts taken to assist Mr. Torden is reported in detail by the embassy in Helsinki, also through social network Contacti and Telegram, and reposted on the online account of the ministry. Thank you. You are welcome. Is news.ru with us? Yes, hello, news.ru is here. Our first question: what's the relationship of Moscow to the promises by Emmanuel Macron to increase his efforts, peacekeeping mediator efforts with regard to Baku and Yerevan, and exerting pressure on Azerbaijan? So, on one hand, we welcome any initiatives that do not run counter to Russia's efforts to normalize relations between Azerbaijan and Armenia, that do not duplicate or undermine them. However, France's activities here are well known, and within the framework of such mediator efforts, we just need to consider the position of both sides of the conflict, both Armenia and Azerbaijan. Without that, we do not need to, we cannot settle this situation. It's just the basics of any mediatorship. The second question: how can the foreign ministry comment on the discussions of in the Turkish media that the grain agreement may be extended without Russia's participation at all? Are such speculations an element of pressure on Russia? Cannot be perceived as a threat? And earlier the media reported talks in Istanbul with the Russian delegation, and do such contacts make sense before the meeting between the presidents of Russia and Turkey? So it's a very broad question. First of all, materials in the Turkish media. I think that any journalist can present their point of view. It's not the point of view of a state, but of some journalists, political scientists, and so on. The second one: can the grain agreement work without Russia? It's just like the G8 without Russia. Without Russia, it will be G7. So those stories, they should have some logics behind them. If it is about an agreement where Russia participates, it cannot work without Russia. It's just physically impossible. If it's about some other agreements where Russia does not participate, you just need to state it directly. So globally, about the position of our country. The president of Russia has made many statements on that issue, and we have withdrawn from this Black Sea initiative, the grain deal, because our interests were not observed by the parties, and it was clear where the obstacles are placed for implementation of what has been agreed by everyone and guaranteed by the UN itself. And it was reported and said by the president of our country that with the implementation of what has been guaranteed to Russia to a full extent is about the return and the observing of all the provisions to a full extent. So after that we can discuss this topic. Then one of the issues discussed during the Russian-Turkish talks announced today by me is the Black Sea initiative to import the Ukrainian food products and the memorandum to ship our food exports. And questions can be asked at the press conference of ministers on the outcome of the discussions. Our position remains open. It has been voiced by our president and our head of the government many times, and I have provided you the comments on all the other issues. Thank you. Is Compact TV Germany with us?
Yes, good afternoon, Madam Zakharova. Good afternoon. I have two questions. Who is responsible for implementing the tasks of Wagner company? Is there an official position of the Crimea as for the new leadership of this private military company? You don't have an in-depth